Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. Appreciate you joining me in this last slot of today. So just a little heads up before we start. The title does say advanced, so that's kind of my excuse of going over some of the basics like really quick, because I have a lot of content and I want to dive into the interesting new parts quite quickly. So I also want to skip over a little bit over all the existing paths that are already, or maybe already known. So I'm Dirk-Jan. I have this company called Outsider Security, where I do a bit of a mix of research and consultancy and training. And I like to do research, write tools, talk at conferences, etc. What we're going to talk about today is about lateral movement from Active Directory to Entra. And we're shortly going to cover the existing hybrid attacks and basically the limitations that are there. Then we're going to talk about policies, and then we're going to talk about Exchange or Exchange hybrids. If that's a little vague, we'll get into that. It will become clearer towards the end, I promise. So first, we are talking about hybrid attacks in this talk. So what does this mean? It means that we are going to start with assuming that we have a hybrid environment and that we have a fully compromised on-prem environment. So the Active Directory, fully compromised, full access, domain admin, and we're going to see what we can actually do from that point to also move to Entra. So a lot of companies, they will probably care more about their on-prem AD than about their Entra, but there are quite a few APTs that are actually interested in this lateral movement, and we have more and more things in the cloud these days, so that's why I think this is relevant. There's of course already a lot of pre-existing research. I'll share some references at the end to the prior work, but I want to highlight a few things. And first of these are these configuration-dependent attacks. So if you have this configured, then you are always going to be vulnerable to these specific methods. And that's going to be ADFS and seamless single sign-on. Also, there's techniques that work in basically every tenant or every hybrid environment. That's the attacks based on the Entra ID connect component, which kind of all integrations have. ADFS is about making your on-prem server responsible for doing the authentication. So the way that works is that ADFS has a certificate and a token signing key, and it uses that to issue SAML tokens. And with these SAML tokens, we can authenticate to Entra. So the concept of this is that you make your on-prem the responsible party for authentication to the cloud. So naturally, if an attacker steals these keys and this certificate, then they can also forge tokens, and they can also basically pretend to be anybody in the cloud. That's kind of the concept how this works. You are explicitly trusting on-prem, so that means that if on-prem is compromised, large part of the cloud is also compromised. Seamless single sign-on, actually quite similar. So seamless single sign-on is quite different in the implementation because this is Kerberos based, which means that there are actually symmetric keys and no asymmetric keys. But with seamless single sign-on, your on-prem AD is again responsible for performing authentication, in this case with service tickets, and these service tickets authenticate you against Entra. If an attacker steals these keys, they can forge their own tickets and they can impersonate users in Entra. So this is all pre-existing stuff, nothing new here. What I do want to highlight with this is that a lot of these things are configured per domain. But domains are a bit different between Active Directory and Entra. So in Active Directory, a domain is really its own thing, its own directory, it has its own structure. Domains are part of a forest. In Entra, that doesn't really exist that way. So in Entra, we have a tenant. And even if you have multiple on-prem AD domains, they all get synced to this one tenant. And in the tenant, all domains are kind of equal. Even though we configure some of these on a per domain basis, which is quite confusing because, again, domains aren't really a thing in Entra. So that means that there is no boundary between custom domains in Entra. And it also means that if you compromise one of the on-prem domains, then usually it means that you can impersonate also use in other hybrid domains. There is, however, a difference between accounts that are synchronized and accounts that are not, or cloud-only accounts. So often people think that Entra works in these kind of silos where each domain is its own silo, and even if you have different on-prem domains, they're synced to their equivalent in Entra. But that's not how it works. So in fact, all these hybrid users are kind of equivalent, so there's no difference between a hybrid user in domain 1 and a hybrid user in domain 2. So that means if we talk about these attacks, for example, if I have two domains, one is managed, which has password hashing, that means that, of course, I can change the passwords from on-prem accounts, but I can also do that for other domains. So it's not just isolated to one domain, but it's actually affecting all the hybrid users. So in reality, if I have a managed domain and a federated domain, then I can use the credentials in a managed domain to also compromise users in the federated domain, and I can actually also use the ADFS server in the federated domain to impersonate any user in the managed domain, because there's no difference between the users. The only thing that we cannot do is compromise cloud-only users. So this is not possible because hybrid users are considered hybrid and cloud-only users are like kind of protected from this. But if you have 100 domains, one of them is compromised, then any hybrid user in the tenant will be compromised. There's a little difference between ADFS and seamless single sign-on, even though they are quite similar, like in the kind of trust that you put in AD. And the main difference is that ADFS can actually also comply with MFA requirements. So SAML tokens can contain MFA claims, and then we can also bypass MFA from on-prem. I mean, it's 2025. Hopefully, everybody has a policy that you need to have MFA to authenticate to the cloud. So with seamless single sign-on, that's a good mitigation because seamless single sign-on only replaces the password. But with ADFS, we can also forge like the MFA status if we compromise the token signing keys. And there are ways to mitigate that, so there's settings that we can change so that MFA claims are not accepted from ADFS, but not everybody has that. So in reality, with ADFS, you can often bypass MFA. And again, these are not isolated to specific domains. Like all the hybrid authentication material works for any hybrid user in your tenant. So we're going to draw a graph, basically, of all the attacks that we have from on-prem to the cloud. So on the left side, we have our on-prem AD. On the right side, we have Entra. And I've already drawn in some previously known attacks. So that means that if you have one of these components on the left-hand side, then we can perform all the attacks on the right-hand side against Entra. And I do want to highlight one of these, and that is the ability to convert cloud-only users to hybrid users. Because I just mentioned that cloud-only users are kind of like not reachable from the on-prem AD, while hybrid users are. But it turns out in many circumstances, we can actually move a user from being a cloud-only user to actually being a hybrid user. And once they're a hybrid user, then we can impersonate them with things like golden SAML, or we can override their password if we're using password hashing. Now, in the past, this worked for any account, and it works through a method called soft matching. So the way that works is that you kind of pretend that there's an account on-prem that has the same user principal name as the cloud account, and then it's like, oh, well, you probably want to merge these. So now we convert the cloud-only account to a hybrid account, and then it's basically considered coming from on-prem. So then it's treated as a hybrid account, and then we can perform all the hybrid attacks also against this account. So it was fixed like in 2019. However, they only fixed this for like active administrators, which is a little bit weird. So actually, Sapir from CrowdStrike at the time found out that it's not fixed for eligible admins. So if you are using privileged identity management, as is the Microsoft recommended best practice, then actually these accounts can be taken over because they don't have an active administrator role. Don't ask me why this is the case, but basically that means that if you have eligible global admins, cloud-only accounts, they can be changed to hybrid accounts, and then you can impersonate them with things like ADFS or with seamless single sign-on or with other techniques. Now, there's mitigation for that, so you can block soft matching and hard matching. Again, I've never actually seen people do this, so go check this out. If you have a hybrid environment, block this. You won't need it in most cases, and it does mitigate against these attacks. Now, if we want to perform any of these attacks, then we do need to have access to the Entra ID Connect credentials. And we can get those with a tool called AD Connect Dump. So I wrote like a few tools also like way back in the time to actually extract these credentials. This used to always be a user account, and we can just extract the username and password from the AD Connect of the Entra ID Connect server, as it's called these days. But you're like, well, that's nice and all, but these days we can actually use Entra ID Connect with a service principal. And you are correct. So that was a change that was introduced, I think it went GA like this month. But it doesn't really change anything attack service-wise, because instead of then dumping the passwords, I just dump the certificate and I dump the private key, and then I can still authenticate as this new account, basically. But you're like, well, we can also store these in a trusted platform module. And again, you're correct. But then if we have this in the TPM, we can just ask the TPM nicely to authenticate on our behalf. We ask it to generate this assertion, and with this assertion, we can still get tokens, and that, again, allow us to impersonate that account. But you're like, well, but then you do need to have persistent access to that host, because you need to talk to this hardware module to actually get these assertions, right? Also not completely true. So if we look at this assertion is basically based on time. So there's a initial time and an expiry time. But these are values that we control ourselves. So nothing stops me from asking the TPM to sign a token for like next week. And then I can authenticate next week. Because there's nothing here that proves that this is actually the current time, or that's actually a time that's like near in the future. Also, if we look at the documentation, it says that there's no restrictions on the expiry time. So in fact, I can just like craft this assertion, make it valid for a year, and then I can use it for the next year. So in reality, there's nothing that changes much. Even if it's in the TPM, that's kind of pointless if you don't secure the assertions or you don't make any proof in the assertions that is based on current time. So these tools that you have here, they're also part of the AD Connect Them toolkit. I published them yesterday, or today, I don't remember. But you can also do this with the new service principal-based setup. So this is very shortly covering the known attacks. And once we can convert a user, if we have these sync credentials, then of course we can also impersonate them if you have seamless sign-on, seamless single sign-on, or we have ADFS. And there's one other thing I want to add to this, and that is the ability to modify policies. And this is also an interesting one. So this was actually documented. So it was documented that the sync account could modify policies. But usually the problem with this is that this is so vague that nobody knows what this really means. So what are policies? What does this even mean? What's the impact of this? So I took a look at the policies, and I had a look at policies in my favorite graph API, not that one, actually a different one, the graph.windows.net, especially the 1.61-internal version. So for those who don't know this one, this is like the secret internal Microsoft version of this API that's not documented, that contains a lot of data that you cannot normally see, even with the official graph.microsoft.com, and it also has some different access restrictions. Now, of course, the first policies, or the most obvious case for policies, are conditional access policies. And yes, conditional access policies could be modified over this endpoint. So even if you had like controls like MFA for your cloud account or something like that, wasn't really useful because the sync account itself could just change the policies, could delete the policies, change the controls, add exclusions. So that's, again, not much security there if you can change these policies for on-prem. This was already disclosed in 2019. Not many people were aware of this. They actually patched it in December 2023. I'm not sure why it took them so long to do this, but that was basically fixed. And now it's kind of restricted to first-party applications. That means that even if you're global admin, you can no longer modify these policies over the Graph API. But this was specific to conditional access policies. And those are not the only policies that we have. So if you look at these policies, then they all have a name. The name is not always very clear what it actually gives you. But I found a few interesting other policies: the on-prem authentication policy, password management policy, the default policy. Each policy also has a type. This was a default policy with type 24, and the external identities policy. So what does this mean? Basically, this is what this means. So the on-premise authentication flow policy is where the seamless single sign-on and pass-through authentication settings are stored. Sounds kind of interesting. I'm going to look at it in a second. The password management policy is where the self-service password reset configuration is. So you can also enable, disable, change the configuration there. The default policy, type 24, stores the authentication methods in the tenant. And the external identities policy is where the B2B collaboration settings are stored. So all of this could be changed by this sync account. And we're going to look at this one first, because this actually controls one of these methods that are very interesting. Because like not everybody has single sign-on or seamless single sign-on, but if we can enable seamless single sign-on from on-prem, that's kind of interesting, I think. So let's look at these policies, how they're structured. And this one is the on-prem authentication policy. And basically what we see here are key credentials. And these actually hold the symmetric Kerberos keys that we are using for authentication. We cannot see the keys. Like even with global admin, you cannot extract these keys or dump them from the cloud. So we cannot read the existing keys, but we can actually add new keys if we want. Now, those keys, they're also used in the secrets property, so I don't know why this structure is so weird. I never fully figured out the format, but basically for this domain, it says these are the keys that are in use, and there's 2 keys per domain, or 4 if you rotate them, basically. And this is all a bit fuzzy because there's, of course, no documentation for this. So it took me a while to figure out the right format. Like, I just tried all the different combinations. At first, I was like, OK, I used the plain text password and the salt or something like that, because it's Kerberos, there's a salt involved. That didn't work. I used like the AES key, but then which AES key do you pick? Because usually there's like 3 major formats for Kerberos keys. In the end, I just put the plain text password, like the plain text Kerberos key, in both fields, and then it worked. And we could basically issue RC4 encrypted Kerberos tickets with this specific key for our new seamless single sign-on configuration. Now, of course, you can replace the existing keys. That's going to break the environment if seamless single sign-on is actually used, so that's not very stealthy. You can also add more keys to an existing domain, but then the next time they're rotated out, basically, so your persistence is not very good. But what you can also do is add them to a onmicrosoft.com domain. So these are, of course, not hybrid domains. These are cloud-only domains, but it's actually valid to have seamless single sign-on keys on these onmicrosoft.com domains, which doesn't make any sense, but it works. And since there's no difference between any of these domains, I just add the keys here, and they will work for any pre-existing hybrid domain. So I just patched this with the configuration and with the Entra ID Connect Sync account. Then we have these new keys that are added for my onmicrosoft.com domain, and I can use that to do Kerberos authentication. Now, for the defenders out there, maybe wondering, like, can I see this in the logs? Answer is no. So I was going to put a screenshot here of the audit log, but it turns out there's literally nothing generated when you do this. There's no event whatsoever. So good luck detecting this, basically. And after we've configured this, then we can authenticate with this backdoor keys. We forge ourselves a Kerberos ticket for any user in any domain in the tenant, as long as it's a hybrid user, because it does need to have a SID configured, then we can impersonate them. But you're like, well, we still have this MFA, right? So we still have multi-factor and seamless single sign-on is only the first factor authentication. Again, you're right. And if we ignore the fact that we could change the policies, there's also a way to fix this, basically, because it turns out that there's this other policy that's called the default policy. That's the key to solving this problem. So if we look at this default policy, then we see all the authentication methods. Now, of course, it's not very useful if I enable like FIDO keys, because just enabling FIDO keys is not going to provision these FIDO keys on accounts. But then they also added the ability to put like external authentication methods here. And then we can just add an extra authentication provider, like a fake MFA provider, and then we can also do the multi-factor. So we can add this from on-prem, and then we can also bypass the MFA for anybody that's in scope of this authentication methods policy. So we just modify this, and we add a new authentication method at external. You can actually set this up with road OIDC. I gave a talk on that a few months ago, so if you want to look at how this actually works in practice, what the protocols are involved, it's on my blog. This is also, like, there's not really any useful logs here, like something was changed. You don't see what was changed, it's just that something was changed, the default policy was changed, but it doesn't tell you what exactly was changed. So you can see that there was a change, but you don't know if it's malicious or not. So again, good luck with detection on this. So we can extend the graph a little bit, and then we can modify policies. And with those policies, we can actually configure seamless single sign-on. So if you didn't have seamless single sign-on, you didn't have ADFS, we can just configure that for you in the tenant. We can also configure a MFA method that works for any account in scope. And then we can, again, impersonate hybrid users. And since we can also convert these users from cloud-only to hybrid, this is going to basically give you global admin in most configurations, I would say. However, this was last year, basically. Then Microsoft actually changed the permissions of the Entra ID Connect account. And honestly, this is one of the best changes they made in years, especially on the hybrid topic. So what they did is basically they removed all the permissions from the Entra ID Connect Sync account to modify objects via the Graph API. So that means that we can no longer do this from on-prem. It's still like a valid post-compromise technique if you're already global admin in the cloud. But yeah, then there's plenty of existing techniques that you can also use. So we have to remove a few things from our attack graph, which is unfortunate for the red teamers here, but fortunate for the defenders. And I guess everyone's tenant is a little bit more secure. So that was the policies part. The next part I want to talk about is Exchange. Now, Exchange and I have a little bit of a history. In 2019, I also found some nice Exchange privilege escalations in on-prem AD. And actually, today we're going to extend that attack service to the cloud. So what I did is I installed Exchange Hybrid. And I looked a little bit at how that hybrid configuration basically works. Now, it turns out that if you configure Exchange Hybrid, that actually it shares a service principal with the Exchange Online version. So the Exchange Hybrid that you have on-prem is actually identical to Exchange Online from the Microsoft point of view. So shared service principal, which means it's like the same application as far as Microsoft is concerned. It also turns out that Exchange Online is actually global admin. So that means if we combine it with the previous information that our Exchange on-prem is basically global admin in the tenant. So how does this work actually? Why is Exchange global admin? Now, basically we're going to look at that in a second. But it turns out that Exchange Hybrid, basically if you configure that for like OAuth authentication on-prem or even for authentication from the on-prem part to the cloud part, then it provisions a certificate on the Exchange Online service principal. So it adds a certificate credential to the online equivalent basically. And that means that we can use the OAuth to client credentials flow to get the same kind of tokens at what Exchange Online can do. Now, of course, we do have to extract this certificate. Well, we already saw that it can be difficult sometimes, so this was really complicated. Like, took me a lot of time to figure out. Okay, not really. I just RDP to the server. I went to certificates. I did right-click, export. They even marked the key as exportable, so I could just say, yes, export the private key, and then I had my own certificate. Or basically, then I was Exchange. So, of course, one then requests tokens for Exchange. And this is a little small to read, but this Microsoft Graph token actually has quite a few interesting permissions. It can read all the data in the tenant, but it can also write to domains. So again, this is one of these weird things, like what does it mean if we can write to domains? So actually this means that we can configure new domains in the tenant, we can remove or modify existing domains, and we can also modify the federation configuration of domains. So with this you can actually, even if there's no ADFS, we can configure ADFS, and then we have all the ADFS attacks again. We can add a token signing certificate, we can issue our own tokens, bypass MFA, and all of that. So I requested a token for Graph. And then we had this, let's like look at the existing federation configuration. You can just modify that to like add a extra token signing certificate. And you see that in this case, my ADFS is configured to not accept MFA claims from on-prem. So that's a very secure configuration. But Exchange can change that. So I just patched that out. And now it's going to accept MFA claims for coming on-prem. So again, I can impersonate any user in the cloud that's a hybrid user, including the multi-factor authentication claim. So we add an extra component, we add Exchange, and Exchange can configure the federation configuration. So we can kind of configure ADFS from Exchange, and then of course we can again impersonate these users. All right, that's fun, but that's kind of documented, like other people already talked about this as well. But I was gonna basically set up Exchange Hybrid and test it if it actually works. And there's a nice command for that, and that's called test OAuth connectivity. So then you can verify whether your Exchange Hybrid is set up correctly. So I run this, and I was like, okay, let's see if we can authenticate to the cloud. And then it said, well, the authentication was successful. Okay, that's nice. But what did it actually do? So I looked into the debug logs, and it was a very deep rabbit hole. So let's see what this actually does. It has some nice detailed information. So it's going to talk to Exchange Online, and Exchange Online says, this is my trusted issuer. This GUID maps to Entra, so it accepts Entra tokens. And then it says it includes the auth server ACS. I never heard of this. So next it's going to get the application token from the auth server ACS, whatever that is. Then it's going to get a actor token from the auth servers on the accounts.accesscontrol.windows.net. I have never heard of this. And it's sending an assertion. Well, at least I know what an assertion is. That's nice. And once it has this actor token, it's sending an unsigned JSON Web Token containing this actor token to the cloud. So we have this token, and we have this other token, and we send that, and we can authenticate. So I did some digging into this, and there's not a lot of documentation you can find on this, especially not from the Exchange side. But I did find, or I created this picture. This sums it up pretty well, I think, because this is like this protocol is like extremely bad. I've seen a lot of bad protocols, but this one definitely wins. All right, so how this works is that there's this thing called the Access Control Service, or ACS. So you would think that if Exchange wants to authenticate, it talks to Entra, it does some authentication, secure mechanisms. Not really. It talks to like the shady brother of Entra, or the shady friend, called ACS. And it says, can I have this actor token? And ACS is like, well, you're Exchange, so you're allowed to get this actor token. And then with that actor token, you can actually impersonate users. So this actor token, you can use it to talk to Exchange online. You can impersonate, for example, Bob. With the same token, you can also impersonate Alice, or basically impersonate anybody in the entire tenant. So these are impersonation tokens. We can just put whoever we want in the unsigned part of the token, and then we can access the data in Exchange as that specific user. So these access tokens look like this. This is an actor token. It's signed by Entra. It contains the audience of Exchange in this case, and it was issued by ACS. And it has this nice flag, trusted for delegation true, which means that we can use this for any other user in the tenant. So we embed this in an unsigned bearer token. We embed this actor token, and we say, well, we want to access the data from this guy called Dirk-Jan at I'm in your cloud. So this whole concept, this whole bad thing, basically, it has a name. It's called service-to-service tokens. So we're going to stare at this slide for a while, because these tokens, they're basically valid for 24 hours. You cannot revoke them. So if somebody has this token, there's like absolutely nothing you can do from a defensive point of view. There are not any logs when they're issued, because this is a Microsoft service principle getting tokens. There's no logs for that. And because they're unsigned, you can also use them for any user in the tenant without actually talking to the identity provider. So again, there's no logs of these being used to impersonate arbitrary users. And most of the Microsoft apps that I've seen can actually do this for any user in the tenant, because they all have this like trusted delegation true flag. This is not subject to any conditional access whatsoever. So once you have this actor token, you can impersonate any user. No security checks, no other things that you can do to stop this. This is, of course, valid for any mailbox in Exchange, but it also turns out to be valid for SharePoint for some reason, because Exchange really needs to talk to SharePoint and access any SharePoint sites or any OneDrive site, basically, because OneDrive is also SharePoint in the tenant. And basically, these service-to-service tokens are what Microsoft uses to basically do calls on behalf of other users in their backend. So this is a Microsoft internal concept that they use to talk between services. And I think this is kind of bad, because if Microsoft is using these things, if one of these tokens leaks, it's basically like 24 hours unlimited access to all the data in an entire tenant. Like, it's unsigned, so you can just switch out the user, you can talk to Exchange, you can talk to SharePoint, and then, basically full access. So Microsoft is also aware that this may be not the best idea. Actually, last month they wrote a blog about them eliminating this high privilege access, service-to-service relationships, etc. And they already mitigated over 1,000 of them, which is of course really great, but it's also quite concerning, because how many are there left of these? How many of these tokens are being passed around that basically impersonate entire tenants at the time? I think this should never have existed in the first place. So it's glad that we're getting rid of them, but it's not ideal. But basically, it fits nicely in our attack graph. So we have full access to Exchange and also full access to SharePoint if we compromise Exchange on-prem. So let's do a little demo. I'm going to request these tokens, and they were going to authenticate to SharePoint. So getting the actor token. And this is the only part where I need to talk to ACS, basically. So this is the only part that needs cloud connectivity. Now I have this access token, and I can do whatever I want for the next 24 hours. So I'm impersonating this user. This user is actually global admin. There's no security controls here, and I'm going to open their OneDrive. And I can actually also use this in a GUI, because the GUI also accepts these tokens. And you see I have access to the OneDrive. Now, if I want to access someone else's OneDrive, I just create a new impersonation token with the other user in there. So I'm switching the user ID, and then we access someone else's OneDrive, and we access someone else's file. So this is great for data exfiltration. This works for SharePoint, it works for Exchange. It used to also work in the GUI of Exchange, but they made some changes there, so that's currently not working, but you can probably fix that, and you can also exfiltrate emails over the API, of course. This also works for the SharePoint admin center if you want, so then you can also change the configuration and just grant yourself access to all the SharePoint sites. So this is fun. And then originally this was going to be most of my talk. Then I was preparing the slides, and I was like, well, let's see if there's some other service that accept these tokens. So then I requested a token for my favorite API, the graph.windows.net, and I got an actor token back. Actor token for graph.windows.net, and trusted for delegation is true. So now we can actually talk to Entra as any user, which is nice. So I crafted a new token. I put my actor token in here. I scoped it to graph.windows.net. And then I did have to figure out like the correct calling convention. So for the SharePoint and OneDrive, we just need to provide the user principal name. Graph.windows.net actually wants to have a net ID parameter. So this is like this GUID. This is something that I actually talked about last time I was here at Black Hat, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, don't remember, about guest access and how these net IDs basically are a unique identifier for a user. It's a bit complicated, but we can just query this. It's like part of the graph.windows.net data schema. So you can see this for this user, for example. Of course, Exchange can list all of these things. So it's nothing that stops us from just querying this and adding that to the token. So this is the net ID for a global admin in this case. I can just create a token as global admin and then talk to graph.windows.net. Yeah, and then I am global admin, so I can just do whatever I want. So we add an extra path. We get full access to Entra as any user in the tenant. And that also means that we can do all these other things again, because of course we can use the graph.windows.net to modify policies. We can even modify conditional access policies again, because this is coming from a first-party service principal, so it's allowed to modify conditional access policies over the API. We can configure seamless single sign-on, we can configure federation, we can add new users, we can make the global admin. Basically, you can do whatever you can over graph.windows.net. All right, let's do another demo. So in this case, we're going to get an actor token for the graph.windows.net. And then we're going to get an impersonation token for my global admin. And then I'm actually going to add a new user to the tenant. And I'm going to make them global admin. So just patching the user, make them global admin. And then we're going to authenticate to the admin center. And it's going to authenticate us automatically. We stay signed in. Go to the users, just finding our newly created global admin. There it is. And it has the global administrator role, as you can see. So we went from being Exchange to basically being anybody, being global admin, adding a new global admin, and compromising the entire tenant from on-prem. Well, in this case, there are audit logs, so that's the good news. And the audit logs look a little bit weird if you do this. So normally, of course, if you make changes in Entra, there will be an event that gets recorded. And in this case, there's actually going to be an event that has both a user principal name from the user that we impersonated, but the display name is going to be Exchange Online. So it's like both Exchange and the user doing something at the same time, and it kind of gets like merged together in a weird way. But this is like a nice sign that it was actually done by a by a malicious account or by somebody that was using Exchange to impersonate other users. So I wrote a detection query for this, and I actually validated this with some people. So to find out what like the legitimate actions are, because this is actually used legitimately by Exchange. Like if you connect to the Exchange PowerShell client and you modify groups over that, in the backend, Exchange will impersonate you and it will modify the groups in the tenant. So that's why these operations are kind of excluded. It also does it with some tenant modifications sometimes. But if you search for this, basically the telltale that Exchange did it and the user did it at both the same time. So thanks to the people that run this in a few environments to see if this reduces the false positives. But this you can actually see if somebody has been doing this in your tenant. Now, if you want to know whether you actually are affected by this, if you have Exchange Online or if you have Exchange Hybrid and you have this set up to interact with like the Exchange Online service or do OAuth in the Exchange Hybrid on-prem, then you probably have this. I mean, not everybody luckily has Exchange Hybrid, so most companies aren't going to have this. But you can see this if you look for the key credentials on the Exchange service principal. Now, of course, you cannot see this in the portal because Microsoft likes to completely hide this possibility from you that you can even configure this on service principals. So you have to use the API, PowerShell module, or something like Road Recon to actually enumerate this data. And if you see key credentials here and you don't have Exchange hybrids, then it's time to start wondering like who added these there and why they're there and where these keys are stored. So if you had this in the past, if you moved away from Exchange hybrid, it's still good to see if there's still any keys here that are valid, because that is still like a remaining risk if somebody can access these keys. So if you don't have this, you should actually remove this to basically mitigate this attack surface and make sure that people cannot authenticate as Exchange in your tenant. Actually, there's also a mitigation plan for this. So it turns out that in April, the Exchange team actually announced that you need to migrate from this. So they split up the service principles. So Exchange will have its own dedicated service principle instead of having the shared service principle with Exchange Online. It's going to be required by October 2025 anyway. So if you have Exchange hybrid, you need to move to this and split this up. So this was like halfway during whenever I submitted the talk, and between this, that there is actually a nice mitigation for this. Now, I didn't consider this lol actors a vulnerability. I kind of thought it was just like a very bad design, essentially. Like it's not accidentally there. Somebody wanted to make this. Somebody actually coded this, thought this was good, and then shipped it. And they configured this to basically allow Exchange and other Microsoft apps to just act like any other user in the tenant. But it's still quite dangerous, so it's like, okay, let's report this to MSRC anyway. 3 weeks ago, so plenty of time. And the product team did actually consider this a vulnerability. So this, I think, the first time that I don't think it's a vulnerability and they did think it's a vulnerability. Usually it's the other way around. But they very quickly shipped a fix to the graph.windows.net impersonation. So actually fixed that like over the weekend. Slightly before they were planning it, but they actually shipped the fix over the weekend, and now you cannot request these kind of impersonation tokens anymore for the graph.windows.net using any of these hybrid service principles. You can still do it for Exchange and SharePoint, so you can still act as anybody in Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, exfiltrate all the data, but at least the graph.windows.net angle is fixed. They even put out a CVE for this today to really point people at like you should apply this mitigation, split up the service principle from Exchange Online and Exchange On-Prem so that you don't have this problem anymore. So I guess we have to remove a few things from our attack path. We no longer get to impersonate anybody. Well, too bad. It was fun while it lasted, but I think we're better off this way. So we can no longer do this, but Exchange still can modify the federation configuration. It can still have access to Exchange and SharePoint Online on behalf of anybody, basically. So to conclude, Entra ID Connect was quite a bit more powerful than what you probably thought. I mean, the policies part was kind of documented, but nobody really knew what it means. So these attack paths have existed for a very long time. They were mitigated finally last year when they removed all the permissions of Entra ID Connect. So that's a great improvement. It turns out that Exchange Hybrid On-Prem is actually the same as Exchange Online. And once you are such a very powerful service principle, then you can actually elevate to global admin because Exchange Online basically has unrestricted access through these service-to-service tokens, or well, not in graph.windows.net anymore because they patched it out. I do think this whole like actor token, service-to-service tokens design is kind of messed up. It like lacks all the security properties that you would want, like auditing, logging, signing, and other protections that you can think of. I don't think this should ever have existed in the first place, so I'm happy they're now finally removing this. But I think it's still also a bit weird that there's all these weird undocumented Microsoft backend flows that we never hear about, but still can impact the security of our tenant, because in this case, these tokens were leaking out to like on-prem setups, and yeah, then you have all kind of consequences. So more transparency about what kind of things Microsoft is actually doing with our data in the backend. I think that's a good thing to have, and it's currently a bit lacking. If you have Exchange Hybrid, then the takeaway should be that you should split up these service principles as soon as possible to kind of migrate from this attack path. Now, as I promised, there's going to be quite a few references, so here's some more reading material on the topic. I will put these slides online to see if you want. And these are all the like existing attack paths, existing reference, previous talks, and other resources if you want to read more about these kind of hybrid attacks. So that kind of closes off the talk. I'm also excited for my next talk. I'm not going to share what it's about yet, but I'm going to share the title. So with that being said, I'm happy to take any questions, not on this part, but on the other parts. And thanks for being there.